The sound echoed like thunder. Captain Thomas Morgan's palm struck Jasmine Washington's cheek, and for a brief moment, time stood still. The passengers around them gasped, whispers slicing through the tension-filled air. A pilot, someone meant to protect lives, had just humiliated a young black woman in first class. But what no one in that cabin knew was that Jasmine Washington wasn't just another passenger. She wasn't just a young woman quietly minding her business. She was the hidden force behind Skyline Airways, a silent billionaire backer whose presence in that seat carried more power than the entire crew combined. Jasmine Washington, just 27 years old, had built her empire brick by brick in the world of technology. She was brilliant, resilient, and fiercely determined. Unlike those who flaunted wealth for validation, Jasmine had learned something different from her grandmother. Power is most effective when silent. Until the right moment. It was a lesson she carried everywhere, a lesson that would guide her in this very moment of disgrace. She had invested in Skyline Airways not for vanity, not for luxury, but because she believed wealth had a higher calling, to reshape opportunities, to open doors for those who'd been locked out for generations. Yet now, here she was, slapped in public, insulted in front of strangers, treated like she didn't belong in a seat she practically owned. And the man behind this cruel act? Captain Thomas Morgan. A veteran pilot whose reputation stretched through decades of service. To the executives at Skyline, he was a man of authority, reliable, too valuable to lose. But the whispers among his crew told another story. He was arrogant, entitled, and deeply feared. He had a history of discriminatory behavior, incidents brushed aside, reports buried under excuses, and complaints quietly silenced. In his mind, he wasn't just flying the plane, he was the enforcer of order. And order, to him, meant keeping people in their place. So when Jasmine walked into first class with her quiet elegance, poised and unshaken, Thomas's arrogance collided with his prejudice. He didn't see a passenger. He didn't see an investor. He didn't even see a human being worthy of respect. He saw a challenge to his authority. And he struck. But here's the twist he never saw coming. The very woman he humiliated was the one who could decide his future. He had no idea that this single act of cruelty would set off a chain reaction, one that would not only shake his career but alter the destiny of the entire airline forever. And I'll ask you this, if you were in Jasmine's position, slapped in front of strangers, yet holding unimaginable power in silence, what would you have done? Would you reveal your strength in the heat of the moment, or wait for the perfect time to strike back? Tell me in the comments. And before we go deeper into this story of humiliation, power, and redemption, don't forget to subscribe, because stories like these remind us that the fight for justice is far from over. The cabin had gone silent after the strike, but Thomas Morgan wasn't done. His arrogance fed off the silence of the passengers, the authority stitched into his uniform, making him believe no one would dare challenge him. He leaned forward, his voice sharp, dripping with disdain. "You people don't belong here." The words carried more weight than the slap itself. They weren't just words of anger, they were centuries of prejudice packed into a single sentence. Every passenger who heard them felt the sting. Some shifted uncomfortably in their seats, others looked away, pretending not to notice. Fear kept most of them quiet, but not everyone. Sophia Rodriguez, a flight attendant standing just a few feet away, froze in horror. Her eyes widened, her lips trembled, but her feet stayed planted. She wanted to speak, to step in, to do the right thing. Yet in her mind, the calculation was brutal. If I intervene, I could lose my job. If I stay silent, I betray my values. It was the kind of moment where justice and survival wrestled for control. And through all of this, Jasmine Washington remained calm. No tears, no raised voice, no shaking hands. She simply looked at Thomas Morgan with steady eyes and said, softly but firmly, "You'll regret those words." The sentence lingered in the air, quiet yet deafening. Passengers glanced at one another, unsure what she meant, but there was something in her tone. A promise, not a threat. Then something unexpected happened. While most tried to hide behind silence, a few passengers reached for their phones. Hidden angles, trembling hands, cameras rolling. One by one, little red lights blinked in the shadows of first class. The slap, the insult, the raw arrogance, it was captured in pixels. And before the flight even touched down, those pixels would set the world on fire. Within minutes, whispers of the incident began circulating online. A shaky video appeared on social media with the caption, "Pilot slaps young black woman in first class." The views skyrocketed. Thousands, then millions. Comments poured in, outrage, shock, disbelief. Strangers from across the globe, people who weren't even on that plane, felt the weight of that slap. Meanwhile, Jasmine sat quietly in her seat. Her heart pounded, but her face remained unreadable. Inside, however, there was a storm. She thought of her grandmother, her guiding voice, the woman who had raised her to believe in patience over rage. Jasmine could almost hear her say, "Child, battles are not won with noise. They're won with timing. Let them underestimate you. Let them think you're weak. Then, when the moment is right, you rise." And so Jasmine waited. She could have spoken then and there. She could have revealed that she wasn't just a passenger, but the very woman funding the airline's existence. She could have destroyed Thomas Morgan's arrogance with one sentence. But she didn't, because Jasmine understood something most people didn't. Power isn't about what you say in anger. Power is about patience. It's about holding your cards until the world is forced to see them. And in that silence, she was already winning. The passengers whispered. Some looked at her with pity, others with admiration. No one knew who she really was, but they felt something, a quiet strength, an aura of control, even in the face of humiliation. She wasn't broken, she was calculating. And outside the walls of that airplane, the story had already left the cabin. It was climbing through algorithms, flooding timelines, sparking debates on news panels. How could a pilot do this? Where's the accountability? The world was watching. And the irony? The man who thought Jasmine didn't belong was about to discover that she didn't just belong in that seat. She belonged in the seat of power that could decide his very future. So let me ask you this. If you were in Jasmine's shoes, slapped, humiliated, and told you didn't belong, but holding a power no one in that cabin could imagine, would you have stayed calm, or would you have revealed the truth right then and there? Let me know in the comments. And before this story goes even deeper, before the consequences crash down like a storm on Captain Morgan and everyone who tried to bury the truth, make sure you subscribe, because this is only the beginning, and the most shocking parts are still to come. The plane landed, but the story was already flying faster than any jet could. By the time passengers collected their bags, the world had seen the clip. Millions of views, countless shares, hashtags rising like wildfire. Justice for Jasmine, Skyline scandal, ground the captain. News anchors replayed the shaky footage over and over. Commentators debated on television. Some voices tried to downplay it. Surely it was a misunderstanding. Others, louder and angrier, called it what it was, blatant discrimination in the very skies that should have represented freedom. And Skyline Airways? They issued a statement within hours. Cold, polished, and carefully worded. A misunderstanding, they said. A communication error. They promised to review procedures, but never once did they admit the truth. It was the kind of apology that only fueled the fire. People weren't stupid. The world saw the slap, they heard the words. A weak apology only made the outrage roar louder. And through all of this noise, Jasmine Washington remained silent. She sat in her apartment, her phone buzzing with constant updates. Friends, investors, journalists, all desperate for her comment. But Jasmine said nothing, because she knew the truth ran deeper than one slap. She wasn't here to win sympathy. She was here to change everything. It was then that an old family friend stepped into the story. Dr. Anthony Davis, a towering figure in civil rights law, a man who had spent decades fighting battles in courtrooms and on protest lines. He had been close to Jasmine's grandmother, the woman whose wisdom shaped Jasmine's quiet strength. To him, Jasmine wasn't just a young billionaire. She was the next generation of a legacy. When he visited her, his words cut through her silence. Jasmine, this isn't just about you. It's not even just about that slap. This is about everyone they think doesn't belong. You have something they don't, a seat at the table, and you can use it to break the table in half if you need to. Jasmine nodded, her grandmother's voice echoing in her heart. Patience, timing, power. But she wasn't the only one wrestling with choices. On the other side of the city, Sofia Rodriguez sat alone in her modest apartment, staring at her reflection. The image of that slap haunted her. She could still hear Thomas Morgan's voice dripping with arrogance, see Jasmine's calm face holding back a storm. Sophia wanted to speak out, to tell the truth, but the risks were brutal. She was a single mother, raising a little girl with nothing but grit and long hours. Her paycheck was survival. Her job wasn't just a uniform, it was her lifeline. If she spoke against the airline, she could lose everything. Yet silence, she realized, would mean her daughter growing up in the same world of injustice. And so Sophia faced her own battle, survival versus justice. The stage was set for the first major twist. At Skyline's headquarters, panic ruled the boardroom. William Preston, the CEO, sat at the head of the table, his face tight with anger. Executives argued back and forth about PR strategies, about lawsuits, about stock prices falling. Some suggested suspending Thomas Morgan for a while. Others pushed for burying the story until the outrage died down. But none of them expected what happened next. As voices clashed, the boardroom door opened. And there she was, Jasmine Washington. Calm, poised, walking in without fanfare, but carrying an energy that froze the room. Some executives recognized her, others looked puzzled. But William Preston, the CEO, narrowed his eyes, already sensing a storm. She sat down at the table, her voice steady. Before you continue discussing damage control, there's something you all need to know. I am not just a passenger. I am not just a victim in your headlines. I own 45% of Skyline Airways. The room went silent. Papers dropped. A few jaws literally fell open. Preston's face darkened. His anger wasn't at the slap or the scandal. It was at her presence, her power. He had spent years believing the airline belonged to men like him, men who looked like him, thought like him. And now, here was Jasmine, shattering that illusion with one sentence. The executives didn't know what to say. The calculations spun in their heads. The woman they thought of as collateral damage wasn't just a passenger. She was their biggest investor. Their survival depended on her. And yet, she didn't raise her voice. She didn't gloat. She simply laid the truth before them, calm as ever. Because Jasmine didn't need to shout. Her power spoke louder than anything they could muster. Now let me ask you this. Imagine being in that boardroom, the tension heavy, the truth hanging in the air. What would you do if you discovered the person you humiliated, the one you thought didn't belong, was actually your biggest backer? Would you apologize? Would you scramble to save yourself? Or would your pride keep you blind? Tell me in the comments. And before we move into the storm that follows, the confrontations, the betrayals, and the downfall of those who thought power was theirs alone, make sure you subscribe, because what's coming next is the moment where everything changes forever. The air inside Skyline's headquarters had grown heavier with each passing day. The scandal wasn't fading, it was growing. What began as a single slap on a flight had spiraled into something the airline could no longer control. Hashtags burned across every social platform. News anchors demanded accountability. Politicians called for investigations. Passengers canceled bookings in droves, and shareholders began whispering of collapse. But in the heart of it all, two men still clung desperately to their power: Captain Thomas Morgan and CEO William Preston. Thomas, the man who had started it all, was unrepentant. When pressed by colleagues to issue an apology, he scoffed. "I don't answer to passengers. I run the skies, not them. If they don't like it, they can fly somewhere else." His arrogance wasn't shaken by the public outrage, it was fed by it. In his mind, he was the airline, the authority, the untouchable. And William Preston? The CEO who had steered Skyline Airways for over a decade believed protecting Thomas meant protecting himself. To admit the pilot was wrong would be to admit the system was broken. And the system was the very thing that kept men like him in control. So he defended Thomas, called him a loyal employee, and dismissed the incident as an unfortunate moment blown out of proportion. Preston wasn't protecting the airline, he was protecting the old order. But Jasmine Washington had other plans. With Dr. Anthony Davis by her side, a man whose very presence reminded the room of battles won and battles still to fight, Jasmine didn't flinch. She came armed with something more powerful than wealth or status: truth. And alongside her was Sophia Rodriguez, the flight attendant who had finally found her courage. Sophia risked everything to step forward. She presented her testimony in detail, her voice shaking at first, then growing stronger with each word. She spoke of what she saw, what she heard, and how Thomas Morgan's arrogance had crossed the line again and again long before that flight. She wasn't just defending Jasmine, she was defending every crew member too afraid to speak. For Sophia, this was the moment where justice mattered more than job security. The evidence was undeniable. Videos, testimonies, passenger statements. It all painted a picture of a culture where arrogance and prejudice had been protected, not punished. And outside the boardroom, the world was watching. Social media didn't just discuss Jasmine, they rallied behind her. Boycott Skyline trended worldwide. Influencers canceled flights live on their platforms. Business travelers pulled contracts. Activists held demonstrations in front of terminals with signs reading, "We belong in first class too." The airline's survival was no longer guaranteed. The pressure was suffocating. Stocks dipped lower each day. Investors demanded answers. And so, the board of directors was called to an emergency session, one that would decide the future of Skyline Airways. Inside that boardroom, the tension could be cut with a knife. On one side sat Preston, pale with fury but clinging to his defense of Morgan. On the other sat Jasmine, calm as ever, her gaze steady, her voice controlled. She didn't shout, she didn't beg. She simply laid the truth bare. This airline cannot rise if it continues to carry the weight of prejudice. You cannot soar if the very people who build your success are crushed beneath arrogance. Either we move forward or we collapse. The debate raged on. Preston raised his voice, threatening that removing Morgan would anger loyal staff. Jasmine countered with facts, showing the cost of boycotts, the numbers of passengers walking away, the long-term destruction of the brand. Dr. Davis reminded the room that history would remember this moment, not as a business decision, but as a moral one. And Sophia's testimony hung in the air, undeniable and raw. Finally, the time came. A vote. One by one, the directors placed their decisions on the table. Each vote carried the weight of the airline's survival. Each vote carried the weight of justice. The results were clear. The old order had lost. Thomas Morgan was stripped of his wings, fired in disgrace. The very man who thought he could define Jasmine's worth was now grounded, permanently. William Preston, the CEO who had ignored injustice for too long, was forced out, his legacy reduced to ashes. And Jasmine Washington, calm, patient, and relentless, stepped into the position of power. Not through noise, not through rage, but through truth, patience, and undeniable strength. The narrator's voice echoed with the weight of the moment. The very man who thought he could define her worth was stripped of his wings. The CEO who ignored injustice was silenced by the truth. And the young woman they all underestimated now carried the power to reshape not just an airline, but an entire industry. So let me ask you this. If you were sitting on that board staring across the table at Jasmine, would you have sided with the old guard or with the future she represented? Drop your answer in the comments. And before we move into the final chapter of this story, the resolution, the reforms, the legacy Jasmine built from humiliation into history, make sure you subscribe. Because what happens next proves that even in the darkest moments, justice always finds its wings. The storm had passed, but in its wake, Skyline Airways would never be the same again. With Captain Morgan disgraced and William Preston forced out, the airline faced an uncertain future. Investors braced for collapse. Employees whispered about instability. Passengers wondered if trust could ever be restored. And then, Jasmine Washington stood before the world. Not as a victim of arrogance, not as a silent shareholder hiding behind wealth, but as the new CEO of Skyline Airways. Her first address wasn't polished with corporate jargon. It wasn't filled with empty promises. It was raw, heartfelt, and powerful. She stood tall and declared, "This airline is no longer a fortress for the privileged few. It will now be a bridge for everyone. A place where respect is not optional, it is mandatory." From this moment forward, Skyline Airways stands for dignity, equality, and opportunity. The sweeping reforms she announced would redefine aviation standards. Anti-discrimination policies that went beyond surface-level words. Policies backed by real enforcement. Diversity hiring programs that reached into communities often ignored, opening doors for those who never believed they could belong in the skies. And most importantly, a zero-tolerance code of conduct for staff at every level. Whether a pilot, crew member, or executive, no one would be above accountability again. And Jasmine didn't stop there. She wanted the story of her rise not just to reshape an airline, but to inspire generations. She remembered her grandmother, the woman who had whispered to her as a child, "You belong wherever your dreams can carry you." In her honor, Jasmine established the Clara Washington Scholarship Fund, a program dedicated to underprivileged youth who dreamed of careers in aviation, engineering, and technology. It wasn't just about putting more pilots in cockpits or engineers in labs. It was about ensuring that no child, no matter where they came from, would ever believe that the skies were closed to them. Applications poured in. Young boys and girls from small towns, from villages, from places no one had ever linked with aviation, suddenly believed they had a chance. Jasmine wasn't just leading an airline, she was building a pipeline of dreamers who would one day lead the world. And then there was Sophia, the quiet flight attendant who had once been terrified to speak up, the woman who risked everything by telling the truth. Jasmine knew bravery when she saw it, and she refused to let it go unrewarded. Sophia was promoted to senior crew trainer, placed in charge of ethics and passenger rights. She now stood before every new cabin crew recruit, not just teaching safety protocols, but reminding them that their voices mattered. That silence in the face of injustice would no longer be the culture of Skyline Airways. Sophia's journey was proof that courage could change an entire company. The transformation was undeniable. What once was a brand associated with arrogance and elitism now became a global example of reform. Other airlines were forced to follow. Policies changed industry-wide, and Jasmine, who had once been underestimated, overlooked, and disrespected, became not just a CEO, but a symbol. Because this story was never just about a slap. It was about what happens when silence is expected, but you choose to stand tall instead. It was about the strength to turn humiliation into history, pain into purpose, and insult into inspiration. Injustice thrives when hidden, but collapses the moment it is exposed to the light. So I'll leave you with this question. What lesson do you take from Jasmine's story? Would you have revealed your power sooner or waited until the perfect moment as she did? Share your thoughts in the comments. I would love to hear your perspective. And before you go, don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more powerful true stories the world needs to hear. Because sometimes the stories we share are the wings that carry us higher than we ever dreamed possible.